In order to ruin the reputation of the newlywed bride, the maid secretly approached a servant. He was disguised as the groom. They even filled the room with a large amount of drugs. Soon, the woman started feeling dizzy and disoriented. However, she suddenly noticed something unusual. The comatose groom's eyes moved slightly. The woman realized something was wrong. She then pretended to get water, intending to take the chance to escape. At this moment, she found the door had been locked from outside. The effects of the drug grew stronger within her body. She grabbed a porcelain object nearby and smashed it onto the servant's head. It turned out the woman was a time traveler. She had accidentally transmigrated into the body of the novel's heroine. She clearly remembered the story of the heroine's wedding day. The groom had been with the bridesmaid instead. From then on, the heroine was neglected and ultimately betrayed cruelly by the man. To rewrite her fate in this lifetime, she knew the man had an older brother who had been paralyzed for years, so she decided to switch grooms and marry the paralyzed brother instead. She then quietly left the room and went to report everything to the matriarch, claiming that on her wedding day, the groom had betrayed her with the maid. The matriarch was enraged upon hearing this. She immediately rushed to the room to investigate. Meanwhile, the maid suddenly realized the bride was gone. While they were still in confusion, the matriarch stormed into the room with others and caught them red-handed. The man shamelessly declared that he and the maid were in love. The matriarch, furious at her grandson's misconduct, berated him harshly on the spot. Only then did the man realize his guilt and agreed to let the bride decide his punishment. The bride secretly rejoiced as the man fell into her trap. She ordered the maid to be beaten 20 strokes, but when she revealed her punishment decision, both the maid and the man refused to comply. The man quickly claimed to the matriarch that the maid was already pregnant and could not be treated so harshly. The maid, thinking the bride was kind-hearted, also tried to gain her sympathy using the unborn child. Little did they know, the bride was already aware of their schemes. To ensure they suffered the consequences, the bride pretended to be wronged and furiously ordered 20 strokes for the maid, then declared she would sell her off. She also stated that the household's harmony was not worth being disturbed by a lowly maid. The man grew furious upon hearing this. He immediately stepped forward to defend the maid, saying she was pregnant and could not endure such punishment. The maid also pleaded, saying she had managed to conceive the man's child with great difficulty, begging the matriarch to spare her for the sake of the family bloodline. However, the bride showed no mercy and publicly slapped the maid across the face. She knew that the original heroine was weak and soft-hearted, which was why the maid had been able to manipulate her, leading to her ultimate betrayal. The matriarch suddenly changed her attitude, saying that the child was innocent, and suggested keeping the maid in the household as a concubine. Unbeknownst to them, all this was part of the bride's plan. The next moment, the bride declared she wanted to switch grooms and marry the prince. Her words shocked everyone. They all knew the prince was bedridden and unconscious due to paralysis. Marrying him was akin to becoming a widow. Even so, the bride insisted on marrying the prince. She declared that the prince had fought valiantly against invaders in his youth and was deeply loved by the people. He had been severely injured on the battlefield and fell into a coma to save the lives of an entire city. The maid realized that if the bride successfully switched grooms, she would lose the opportunity to take over her dowry, so she tried to stop her at all costs. The bride publicly stated that she would forgive the maid only if she agreed to abort her child. The man was even more enraged upon hearing this. Although he didn't love the bride, her dowry was extremely generous. Now that the bride was becoming his sister-in-law, the dowry would no longer be his, and if the bride bore an heir with his older brother one day, his status in the household would only decline further. However, to protect the child, he had no choice but to agree to the switch. At that moment, the man's mother burst into the scene. She claimed that the bride was brought into the family in a grand wedding ceremony and could not simply be given to someone else. She knew that if the bride successfully brought fortune to the prince, her own son would lose the opportunity to inherit the household's noble position. No matter how much the mother tried to intervene, she could not sway the matriarch's decision, so she reluctantly agreed to let the bride remarry and marry the prince that very night. Later, they saw the bride moving all her dowry into the prince's quarters, watching chests of gold and jewels being carried away. The man's mother was filled with resentment and frustration. She vented all her anger on the maid and remarked that if the bride bore the prince's child in the future, there would be someone to share the inheritance of the household. To prevent the bride from marrying the prince, they bribed the prince's maid and secretly sent a servant into the room. They moved the unconscious prince behind the bed and had the servant pretend to be the prince to marry the bride. To set the scene perfectly, the maid filled the room with a large amount of intoxicating drugs. Little did they know, everything was within the bride's control.